पूर्णमदः पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। वसुदेवसुतं देवं कंसचाणूरमर्दनं देवकी परमानन्दं कृष्णं वन्दे जगद्गुरुं। सर्वोपनिषदो गावो दुग्धा गोपालनन्दनः पार्थो वत्सः सुधीर्भोक्ता दुग्धं गीतामृतं महत्। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। So, Srimad Bhagavad Gita, also known as the Yoga Shastra, the teachings on yoga, of which we are studying the 4th chapter, and in our last class we had studied the 10th verse of the 4th chapter, which in this small booklet is on page number 74. We had completed number 10, and today we will study the 11th one, number 11, on page number 74. Shri Krishna in the previous verses had spoken about various manifestations, about avatara, the principle of avatara, the principle of incarnation, when the divinity descends onto this earth, and what that means, that we all discussed in great detail. A striking feature of the yogic teachings, an outstanding aspect of the yogic teachings, is its universal approach expressed by Patanjali, the master of the Yoga Sutras, when he speaks of Chitta Parikarma or Chitta Prasada, both two words but they mean the same thing. the practices which purify the mind content, practices which enable the mind content to settle down. And he speaks, there are 7 sutras that he has dedicated to these practices. The first one talks about Maitri, Karuna, friendliness, compassion, forgiveness, practicing these virtues in one's life. Then he also speaks of pranayama, prachardhan vidharanabhyam va pranasya, by retention and expelling the prana. The last sutra there amongst these 7 sutras is by focusing one's mind, is by meditating upon any object according to one's choice. Yatha bhimata dhyana. Dhyana means meditation, retention, contemplation, and yatha bhimata according to one's choice. And this is what gives tremendous freedom in choosing the object that a person chooses for himself for the sake of meditation, and also underlies the very unity in diversity that we see in the yogic traditions. And this shloka, the next shloka, is about that. This idea is very important because it allows various traditions, various understandings, various interpretations of the teachings coexist peacefully and also share the same places of worship in some cases, as we see in the history of India. So I will talk a little bit about that as an introduction to this shloka, so that we can appreciate the importance in the historical context of these teachings. As we know, historically, yoga has been deeply influenced, even though the concept, of course, is in the Vedas, in the Upanishads. But the practical approach to yoga has been developed by not a single tradition, but by various traditions. What we call Raja Yoga is Patanjali's tradition. Patanjali's tradition is known as Raja Yoga, the king of all yogas, or the root Raj also means to enlighten, light. Rajri Diptau, the root means to enlighten. So the yoga of light, that is also what Raja Yoga means. Now, Raja Yoga tradition is primarily a Vaishnava tradition. It worships Vishnu as its favorite form of the divinity, and that is the reason the form that we see of Patanjali here, he has Shankha, a conch, in one of his hands, and the chakra, the discus, in another hand, which symbolizes his relationship with Lord Vishnu. So Raja Yoga, even when we look at the teachings of the masters in the Raja Yoga tradition, it is all centered around worshipping Vishnu as a form of the divinity. On the other hand, when we look at the other influential tradition of yoga, Hatha Yoga, which is not radically different from Raja Yoga, but is only different in the sense that it prepares the very foundation of Raja Yoga by focusing more deeply on asana, pranayama, and mudras, etc. The first few limbs of yoga. So it is really like focusing on the very preparation of Raja Yoga. So it's not a radically different path. It is just Swatma Rama in his Hatha Yoga Pradipika makes it very clear that Hatha Yoga is a preparation to ascend, to climb to Raja Yoga. Ha is prana, tha is apana, the union of both in pranayama, that is hatha and hatha yoga. That is how hatha yoga is explained. However, the masters in the hatha yoga tradition, starting from Guru Gorakshanatha, and if you look Ghiranda Samhita, Shiva Samhita, all these hatha yoga texts, hatha yoga pradipika, namostutas adinathaya namostutasmai yenopadishta hatha yoga vidya, that prostration to Adinatha Shiva, this tradition primarily worships Shiva as a form of that supreme divinity. So the influence of Shaivism is tremendous on hatha yoga traditions. While Raja Yoga traditions are deeply influenced by Vaishnavism, hatha yoga tradition is deeply influenced by Shaivism. Then yoga is not only limited to these two traditions. There are Buddhist yoga traditions, such as Acharya Asanga has done tremendous work on yoga, Yogachara, known as the Yogachara tradition, also known as Vijnanavada. Buddha Ghosha has done a lot of work. And like this, many great masters in Buddhist traditions have done a lot of work in the field of yoga. And their primary object of worship was Buddha. Then, when we speak of the history of yoga, how can we forget great thinkers like Haribhadra Suri, 8th century great master of the yogic traditions, who was a Jain and who has written amazing works, Yoga Bindu, Yoga Drishti Samuchaya, Yoga Shataka, all works on yoga. And he was a Jain. So his object of worship would have been Mahavira and the rest of the 23 Tirthankaras, the 23 path makers that are worshipped in the Jain tradition, prior to Mahavira. Yet, when it comes to the practical approach of yoga, all these masters of various traditions, amazingly, there might be philosophical differences. There are tremendous philosophical differences amongst these masters. There are tremendous differences in their faith, in their practices, in their rituals. And yet, when it comes to yoga, one thing that all of them point out, ascertain, is that, for example, Haribhadra Suri, this Jain master, he points out that Sarvesham eva shastranam, yoga shastranam, tattvena avirodha, which means that all teachings on yoga, in essence, in reality, there is no contradiction in these teachings. There is no mutual contradiction. In reality, in tattvata, if you go deeper into those teachings, then avirodha. There is no virodha, there is no contradiction, there is no opposition amongst the teachings, whether they are the teachings of my tradition or of any other tradition. Why? Moksha hetur yatah yoga. Because ultimately yoga is the practical approach to free oneself from the clutches of ignorance, from the darkness of ignorance. Bhidyate natatah kvachit. And therefore there can be no difference. There can be no bheda. It's just not possible. It is completely impossible. This is his view. Now, let us look, for example, at Vidyaranya Muni's view. Vidyaranya Muni was a 12th century great thinker of the Vedanta tradition, also the 12th master of the Sringeri Pitha, which is a highly respected monastery in India, an extremely ancient monastery, a place of learning, the most respected place of learning in India. And he, the 12th master of that place, who is considered a great authority in the Vedanta tradition, he points out the same thing. Arhata, may it be the Jainas, Bauddha, may it be the Buddhists, Vaisheshika, Nayayika, may it be the logicians, Shaiva, the worshippers of Shiva. Vaishnava, the worshippers of Vishnu. Shakta, the worshippers of Shakti, the Divine Mother as a manifestation of that Supreme Divinity. Sankhya, the followers of the path of knowledge. Yoga, the followers of the Raja Yoga tradition. In all these teachings, philosophically, there might be differences, but the practical approach to freedom from ignorance, moksha sadhanasya, the means to acquire freedom from ignorance, which is yama niyamadi ashtanga sadhana. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. These 8 limbs, which is what yoga is, ashtanga yoga se ekavidhatvat. That is one and the same. We see Buddha sitting in Padmasana. We see Mahavira sitting in Padmasana. We see in his meditative postures Vishnu, Brahma, Shiva, all of them are, we see them sitting in in the same Padmasana. So there is no difference. Ashtanga yoga se ekavidhatvad. In reality, that Ashtanga yoga is only of one kind, and tasmad avisamvadena, someone who has realized this inherent unity, this lack of opposition in the teachings. Sarva sammato yogishvara. Such a master of yoga, such a yogishvara, such a practitioner of yoga becomes sarva sammata. He becomes acceptable to all, because he has nothing to teach which would be opposing to anybody. What he teaches is acceptable, is universal, is acceptable to everybody. This is what Vidyaranya Muni in his beautiful text Jivan Mukti Viveka, in which he defines someone who has ascended the ultimate goal of yoga, a Jivan Mukta, somebody who has acquired freedom from his mental limitations while he is still alive. While defining the property of such an individual, he speaks of this. So with this understanding, the difference in name and form doesn't matter anything at all. Then whether it is the form of Shiva, the name of Shiva, or the form of Vishnu, or the name of Vishnu, it doesn't matter. Shiva's, like some of the Hatha Yogic masters say, Shivasya Hridayam Vishnuhu. Vishnu is the very heart of Shiva, and Vishnushcha Hridayam Shiva. And Shiva is the very heart of Vishnu. They are one and the same. This is what we also see there have been, if you look at, if you visit some of the ancient museums in India and abroad also, you will see this Harihara Swarupa, half Vishnu and half Shiva. And this was a highly popular deity. I mean, it was not only popular in all over India, but even if you look at the Prambanan temples in Java, in Indonesia, they have beautiful statues of Harihara. Beautiful statues. So, similarly, not only this, but for example, if someone goes to Muktinath in Nepal, one of the most sacred places in Nepal after Kathmandu, like Kathmandu, Pashupatinath and Muktinath. Muktinath, Hindus visit it, Buddhists visit it. And the main priest there is a Buddhist. Yet if you ask the Hindus, then the statue there is the statue of Vishnu. If you ask the Buddhists, they will tell you the statue is of Avalokiteshvara, Buddha. So one goes there, worships Vishnu, the other one goes there, the same statue. And the same is true also in Himachal Pradesh. There are many, higher beyond Manali, there are many ancient temples which for Buddhist lamas, they are Shiva temples, known as Shiva temples. But by Buddhist lamas, they are considered Buddha's temples, and by Hindus, they are considered Shiva temples. So that that is what I think what enabled these traditions. For example, in Sharda Pitha, which was the temple of the goddess of wisdom, which was, I think, one of the most important place of learning in ancient India, which is now in Pakistan occupied Kashmir in a state of ruins. But earlier, when we look at its tradition, we see how Hindu traditions and Buddhist traditions and Jain traditions, all the three traditions, were living there, practicing, studying and teaching. So there was no, and we see that also in the Ellora Ajanta caves, where all the three different religions have carved out statues of their own forms of divinity from the same monolith, from the same single rock. So like this, this unity in diversity, I think this is a very key point in the history of India. And yes, this quotation that is often quoted by Udayanacharya, the greatest logician who ever lived in India, the greatest logician. I mean, Udayanacharya, when it comes to Indian traditional logic, particularly modern logic, which was developed after the 10th, 11th century, because in India, logic, the system of logic is divided into the ancient logic, Prachina Nyaya, and modern logic. So he's the father of modern logic. And in one of his prayers, who was otherwise, who saw Buddhism as his key opponent in philosophical discussions, because he took a theistic position and Buddhism has an atheistic or agnostic position. So they were adversaries in philosophical discussions. Yet at the beginning of his texts, he points out that Yam Shaivaha Samupasate Shiva iti, the worshippers of Shiva call him Shiva, Brahmeti Vedantinaha, the students of the Upanishads call it Brahman, pure consciousness, Bauddhaha Buddha iti, and the Buddhists call it Buddha, Pramana Patavah Karteti Nayyayikaha, we, the logicians, call it the Supreme Creator. And Arhan Nityatha Jaina Shasanam, the Jaina teachings call it Arhat, the achieved one, Karmeti Mimamsakaha, the atheist Mimamsakas who only believe in karma and don't believe in God at all, they call it karma. They call it the principle of karma. Soyam vo vidadhatu vanchita phalam. Whoever fulfills the desire of those who worship it in whatever form, that is what we are referring to. That is the Lord of the entire world. And similarly, in Mahatma Gandhi's prayer, which also comes, which of course comes from the Puranas, Vishnurva, whether it is Vishnu, Tripurantakova, whether it is Shiva, Brahma, Indra, or Buddhotha Siddhothava, whether it is the Buddha or Siddha, the Jaina teachers. The most important thing, Raga, Dvesha, Visharti, Moha, Rahitaha, anyone who is free from the poison of selfish attachment and hatred. Anyone who is free from these two things, Raga, selfish attachment, and Dvesha, hatred. Visha is poison, this is the poison. Anyone who is free from these two things, Sattvanukampodyato, and is ever engaged in the well-being of all beings, Sattva Anukampa, who is ready to descend his grace on all beings, Sattvanukampodyato, Yaha Sarvaihi Saha Sanskrito Gunaganaihi, and who has all the noble virtues within him, Tasmai Namaha Sarvada. We eternally bow down to such a principle. Whatever you call it, it doesn't make any difference. So this unity in diversity, which is the very cornerstone of the yogic traditions, and which really goes back into the very origins of the yoga, which is found in the Vedas, Ekam Sat, the pure existence is one. Vipraha Bahudha Vadanti, the wise express it in various ways. Or Ekam Jyotir Bahudha Vibhati, the Atharva Veda beautifully points out that the light is one, but just it shines in its various manifestations. The principal light, Yadekam Jyotihi, the light, the principle of light is one, but Bahudha Vibhati. It shines in its various manifestations. So that acceptance, and then which the Shatpada Brahmana beautifully points out, that whoever worships that divinity in whatever form, that divinity according to the devotion of that worshipper assumes that form and reveals itself in the purified heart of that devotee in that form and allows the grace to descend upon it in that very form. So this idea that is there, to acquire, because the final goal is to acquire mental stillness, stability, calmness, development of positive virtues. So ultimately it doesn't really matter which symbols we use to acquire it. This is what this shloka is about, how all the different paths lead to the same divinity. And with whatever desire, with whatever wish, with whatever preconceptions a person comes to that divinity, in whatever form it evokes its presence, it manifests itself, it reveals itself in that very form. This is what this next shloka is about. Let us pronounce it. It's once again on page number 74, the 11th verse of the 4th chapter. Ye yatha mam prapadyante. I will pronounce one word and then you can follow me. Ye yatha mam prapadyante tans tathaiva bhajamyaham mama vartma anuvartante manushyaah partha sarvashah ye yatha mam prapadyante tans tathaiva bhajamyaham mama vartmanuvartante manushyaah partha sarvashah. Ye, those who, ye means those who, yatha, in whatever manner, yena prakarena, in whatever manner, with whatever purpose, yatha also means with whatever purpose, whatever desiring, they come to me, mam prapadyante, they come to me, they approach me. The word prapadyante, the word which symbolizes prapatti, is the key word in this first sentence of this word. The key word is prapatti, to take refuge. approach to take refuge, whether it is taking refuge in the Buddha's teachings, Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami, taking refuge there, taking refuge in the Jaina teachings, or taking refuge in these teachings. What does that idea of taking refuge really mean? And why is it so important? Whether we call it taking refuge, taking shelter, or surrender. Prapatti means surrender, prapatti means taking refuge, surrendering oneself. That is the most important thing. Patanjali calls it Ishvara Pranidhana, to place oneself. To place oneself or something, whatever, to place in front of the divine. Pranidhana. Nidhana means to place down, and pranidhana means to place completely. So that is the fifth niyama he speaks about. Prapatti is the same thing. And what does that stand? It is a conscious attempt of freeing oneself from the pride, the ego, the blockage of omniscience that we seem to have. I know everything. And with this blockage, we completely lose the receptivity to receive anything novel, anything new. Because the moment we have decided for ourselves that I know everything, there is nothing to be known for me anymore. And I have actively closed myself completely for any new wisdom, any new understanding, any new perspective. So we can easily say, let beautiful thoughts come to us from the entire world. It has become a very famous quotation which originally comes from the Rig Veda. I see it at homes many times when I visit various places in and out of India. Very few people realize that it is the translation of this mantra, Ano Bhadraha Kratavo Yantu Vishwataha. Let beneficial thoughts, auspicious thoughts come to us from the entire world. But they just translate this much. What lies after that in the mantra? Ano Bhadraha Kratavo Yantu Vishwataha Adabdhasaha. Thoughts which are non-violent in nature, which don't commit violence on anybody. Such, yes, we can accept thoughts, but if that thought is a violent thought, if it inspires violence in us, then such a thought has to be filtered out. How can we accept such a thought which is violent in nature? So adabdhasaha and then aparitasaha. Let it come unhindered to me. Aparitasaha. Parita means when we hinder something. And how does that happen? That happens when we open up ourselves. And it is only then that such wisdom, udbhidaha, it uproots our vices. Udbhidaha means thoughts which uproot our vices, which uproot our discrepancies, which uproot our ignorance. But for that, a receptivity has to be generated. And it is this receptivity, when a person generates this receptivity within himself, which in other words is, you can call it emptying oneself, so that the purifying waters in which we are ever floating can enter within. There is a beautiful story about the Buddha. He lived the life of a beggar. He used to beg from home to home. People would invite him. Bhikshuka, that's what the word bhikshu for a Buddhist monk means, a beggar. Bhikshu, somebody who lives on bhiksha. And there is a beautiful anecdote in his life that once, I think it was Sujata. She worked as a prostitute. And she invited him to have food at her home. And at the same time, she also, in her invitation, she requested him that when you come to my home, please also give me some teaching so that I can find upliftment. Upasampada, as they call it, teaching so that I can uplift myself. The Buddha accepted the invitation, went to her, and when he gave her his begging bowl to put food into it, she had prepared kheer, rice cooked in, sweet rice cooked in milk. When he gave his bowl to her, she saw the bowl is very dirty. Then she said, "Oh, your bowl is very dirty. Let me first clean it. And otherwise the kheer that I have made for you will also become unclean, will become dirty. So let me first clean it, and then I will put it." And then to that he said, "This is all that I wanted to teach you." To receive the wisdom is everywhere. The same wisdom is in Buddha's teachings, the same wisdom is in the Upanishadic teachings, the same wisdom is in the teaching of the Gita. Everywhere it is the same wisdom. Every master, every student speaks of the same thing. Yet the problem is in our receptivity, in whether we have generated that receptivity within us or not. Prapatti, Sharanagati, these words, they stand for that. Gita itself, if you look at the second chapter, at the beginning of Sri Krishna's discourse, it is only after Krishna saw the receptivity in his listener, in Arjuna, when he says, "Shishyasteham shadhimam tvam prapannam," I am now ready to be taught by you. That is what the word Shishya, student in Sanskrit, means. Somebody who is capable of receiving wisdom. Shadhimam tvam prapannam. There also the word prapanna, prapatti has come. Which is like, by taking refuge, by surrendering ourselves, we make this conscious choice. That this is what I have chosen for myself, this is what I want, and when that choice is done, then the rest happens on its own. That is what, because we say, the yogic masters often point out that the grace of the divine is ever present, equally showering over everybody. The grace of the masters is ever present, equally showering without any difference upon everybody. The grace of the teachings is showering equally upon everybody. What is lacking is only our own grace, Atma Kripa, the grace of the individual, whether we have made the conscious effort of choosing it, whether we have made the conscious effort of directing our attention to it. That is the question. And that is what here, whoever takes refuge in me, which has been translated here, howsoever men seek me. The prapatti does not mean to seek, to search. It is in that sense that the translation is meaningful. In yoga asanas, asanas like Adhomukha, Virasana, when we start our yoga class, they symbolize that. Chaturanga Dandasana, actually the whole Surya Namaskara is about that. Solar sun salutations, they are all about that. Ashtanga Dandasana, which we call Sashtanga Dandavat Pranama, to lie down on the ground with all the 8 limbs. Chaturanga Dandasana is with 4 limbs, and Ashtanga Dandasana is with all the 8 limbs. All these various asanas, or whether these are the mudras such as Anjali Mudra, we see Patanjali. In Patanjali, his name itself symbolizes that surrender in which Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and a bowed close to the heart, Bhakti Yoga with a bowed down head, Jnana Yoga, all these 3 faculties of action, the faculty of love, and the faculty of cognition, understanding, all the three of them surrendered for the same cause, surrendered to the same divinity. That is what Namaste basically means. That is what Namaste is about. So whether it is Anjali Mudra or Pranamasana, call it some people call it Pranamasana, it stands for the same thing. In fact, why to limit it only to a few asanas? Most bends, whether they are forward bends or backward bends, they are about that. Paschima Namaskara, Namaskara in the back, different types of Namaskaras. What are we doing? What are we doing in these asanas? It is not prostration to a divinity that is radically different from us, somewhere out there or somewhere up there, completely inaccessible to us. Nothing like that, at least not in the understanding of the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the yoga, the teachings of yoga, which is completely different from us. But it is the prostration, the surrender of the perishable aspect of our being to the imperishable aspect of our being. The body is the perishable aspect. It surrenders to the imperishable aspect. The mind is a perishable aspect. It surrenders to the imperishable core. Even the intellect, the senses, they are all perishable aspects. They are surrendered to the imperishable core, what we discussed yesterday in the Upanishadic class, Atman, the self. That imperishable. So it's not venerating, worshipping an entity, a king-like entity somewhere out there, but what is within us. I think this is a very core idea. Ishvara sarvabhutanam hrideshir tishtati. The Gita points out that supreme divinity which resides in the heart of not only all human beings but all beings. And Ishavasya Upanishad also, Ishavasyamidam sarvam, the whole idea there in the first mantra was about this. So what is the benefit of doing this? Well, what is the benefit of all these bends? Why do we practice all these forward, backward bends? We lose rigidity. The rigidity that is there. Now I'm talking on a very physical level, but it is equally true on a psychological level. Because we are not only rigid on our physical level, but with that, as we grow up, we also become rigid on psychological level. And it is that rigidity which blocks new information, which forces us to close our windows into the face of the new ray of fresh sunlight or a fresh gust of wind. So these bends, backward bends, forward bends, like they destroy rigidity on a physical level and generate flexibility on a physical level. The same when we do it with the mind, the same happens on the mental level as well. So this prapatti is about that. Ye yatha mam prapadyante tans tathaiva bhajamyaham. In whatever manner they take refuge in me, they surrender themselves to me. And when he uses the word me, let me point out very clear, Krishna, we should not take him as an individual person. But Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum, he is that universal master of which Patanjali speaks about, the master of all masters, that inner master from where all the teachings of all the masters ultimately originate. It is that inner master that he is identifying here with in his teaching. I keep on pointing out that again and again. Tans tathaiva bhajamyaham, those I do accept them in that same way, in whatever manner, with whatever purpose, with whatever manner they approach me, I Bhajami, I accept them. How does he translate it? So do I approach them. Now bhajami does not really mean to approach. Bhajami means to serve. Bhaj means, the root bhaj in Sanskrit means to serve. And this is a beautiful idea because the same root is used when a devotee approaches the divine. The devotee serves the divinity, and here Shri Krishna uses for the divine towards the devotee, which means both are serving each other. The devotee is serving the divine, and humanity serves God, and God serves humanity. This root that has been used here is a very interesting root. Tans tathaiva bhajamyaham, and then yes, mama vartmanu vartante. Each one of them, manushyaha partha sarvashaha, all manushyas, all human beings, sarvashaha, on all sides, O Arjuna, mama vartmanu vartante, follow the path which ultimately leads to me, the same entity. Whatever path they take, it doesn't matter. We can come to Rishikesh from all the different directions. It depends where a person is standing. I mean, if somebody is coming from Badrinath, you wouldn't describe on the telephone the path that comes from Haridwar. Because if a person is in Devprayag, he will have to come to Rishikesh from this path. And somebody who is in Haridwar, he will have to come from south. So the directions are different. But relative to where the person is standing at that particular moment, he takes the path starting from there, and the final goal, the ultimate goal, which is nowhere out there but deep within, that goal, that ultimate goal is always the same. And a beautiful example that usually is given in the teachings of the yogic masters, every drop that falls down from a cloud, its final destination, however long it takes it to reach there, its final destination is always the ocean. Akashat patitam toyam yatha gacchati sagaram. Akashat patitam toyam. Every drop of water that falls from the sky, yatha gacchati sagaram, like ultimately reaches the infinite ocean, because it has come from there. That is its ultimate origin, and that will be its final destination. So similarly, sarva deva namaskara, the namaskara done to any form of divinity, keshavam pratigacchati, ultimately reaches that supreme divinity. There should be no confusion in that. There are various paths. Why do we have these various paths? If you carefully, I mean, not everybody understands these beautiful prayers, but if you listen to the evening prayer on the other side at Ganga Aarti, when they recite Shiva Mahimna Stotra, it's in Sanskrit, and it is recited in most of the ashrams in Rishikesh and all over India. Ruchinam Vaichitriyad Riju Kutila Nana Pathajusham Nrinameko Gamyas Twamasi Payasamarnava. Exactly the same thing has also been pointed out there, that Ruchinam Vaichitriyat, due to a difference in interests. Somebody has other interests, somebody has other interests. Due to difference in interests, Ruchinam Vaichitriyad Riju. Some people take a straight path, some people take a carved course, an indirect path, but Nana Pathajusham, all these human beings who have chosen paths for themselves, various paths for themselves, O Supreme Divinity, you are the ultimate goal. Payasamarnava iva, again the same thing, like the ultimate goal of every drop of water is the ocean. So this idea that mama vartmanu vartante manushyaha partha sarvashaha, all human beings ultimately from all sides follow the path which ultimately leads to me, and me, by me Krishna means that divinity which resides at the core of all beings, which is what Shri Krishna in the 5th chapter, in the next chapter, when he will explain this idea a little bit further, he will call it sama. Sama. He uses the word sama for it. Nirdosham hi samam brahma. Sama. Brahman, pure consciousness, is sama. And what does sama means? Sama is the cognate word for, is the cognate Sanskrit word for the English word same. You can even see the similarity. Sama and same. The entity which is sama. And this concept, just of 2 words, is one of the most central concept of the Bhagavad Gita, of the yogic teachings, of the Upanishads. The very definition of yoga provided by the Bhagavad Gita is samatvam yoga uchyate. What is yoga? Yoga is to develop this sameness, this samatva, this equanimity towards all. Sama is also in the Upanishads, because we are also at the same time we are studying Upanishads in our other classes, so I always like to relate these ideas with the Upanishad. And this is a particularly beautiful idea where originally in the Upanishads the word sama has been used for the sun. Sun. Adityo havai samaha. Aditya is sarvada samah. It is always the same. The sun is always the same. Unlike the moon, which becomes less and more, the sun is always the same. That is the first application of, that is the first reason why the sun is called sama. The second reason is that it enlightens all equally. And to everybody it seems that the sun enlightens the world for me. Mam prati iti sarvada samaha. You see, if somebody is running into the north direction, if you drive very fast into the north, you would see the sun running with you, isn't it? Into the same direction. At the same time, the next person who is running from north to south, if he looks at the sun is running with him from north to south. That is the beauty of the sun. If a person thinks, to everybody it seems like this is my sun. This is the sun which is there to enlighten my world for me. And it is this equal approach, this equanimity, this samatva, this sameness that is there in the sun. That is the reason the Upanishadic masters say that we call it sama. And from there the word sama has come, which is the word in Sama Veda, one of the name of the Vedas. Tena sama, like this. So this idea of sama, and by cultivating it through yogic practices in one's life, and thus becoming godlike in that sense, like the sun, like the divine, is same, equal to all in the same way, when his devotee becomes the same and towards all, and is, as the Bhagavad Gita repeatedly points out, Sarvabhuta Hideyarataha, is constantly engaged in the well-being of all beings. It is these ideas in which this shloka, this 11th verse of the 4th chapter, should be seen. The next verse talks about the same idea, but we will discuss it in our next class, next session. Today the time is over. Still, if there are any comments or any feedback, yes?
In general, what you mentioned about how the sun, the experience of watching the sunset, for example, do you see that direct path of reflection of the light
in this.
It looks as if you are the center of the world because it's just only for you. But
Yeah.
at the same time, the person next
Exactly.
to you experiences the same
Yes,
thing,
yes, yes,
due to
yes.
the infinitely large values of Mother Earth.
Exactly.
And temperature.
Yes.
And everyone gets their
Everybody
own
gets
fair,
their own.
safe
Yes,
right.
yes. And I think if we see religion in this perspective, then there would be no confrontation, there would be no conflict anymore. Because to every master it seems as if it's their very personal message given to them, yet it is beautifully explained by this. And then there will be no conflict, there will be no contradiction anymore. So this is what I think, because on a superficial level, in every religion we see a lot of contradiction, in philosophical approaches we see a lot of difference. Yet when it comes to the mystical approach, and that is the reason I really love the mystical approach. For example, when Saint Martin says that all mystics come from the same country and speak the same language, it is that which deeply touches me, because that is what yoga is about. That is what the universal teachings of the Upanishads and the Vedas are about, in which there is no difference between my and your. I am Nijaha Paroveti, this belongs to me and this belongs to you. That difference does not exist. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole earth becomes one single family. So that has a foundation of our spiritual practices, resolves the conflict which creates so much unnecessary trouble and unnecessary affliction for thousands and thousands of people, and confusion in the mind of practitioners often. Yes?
On a different note, that's my question. I'm not quite sure where I read this. I should have remembered, but I don't. That Ashtanga Yoga is Raja Yoga. And as such, as Raja Yoga is raw yoga. And one could also say that it's supreme yoga. And also the highest form of yoga. And superior yoga as well. Does that also mean that other forms, other approaches, other styles of yoga are inferior if that is superior?
Not at all. First of all, the superiority has to be understood in the sense that it is where other forms lead to. Ashtanga Yoga is not, one should not equate Ashtanga Yoga with Raja Yoga. First, let me make that very clear. No. Raja Yoga is the name of the complete philosophical approach of Patanjali. Ashtanga Yoga is one aspect in it. Ashtanga Yoga are the 8 limbs which prepare a person for what Patanjali calls ultimately just yoga. Patanjali did not use the word Raja Yoga. It must be made very clear, not once in his Yoga Sutras. This is the name given later when other yogic traditions came into existence, which were further refining the preparatory steps. They started using the word Raja Yoga for what they called the ultimate final goal of samadhi, deepest states of meditation, which Patanjali speaks about. So it's not a word that was chosen by Patanjali for him. He just uses the word yoga. For him there is just yoga chitta vritti nirodha, atha yoga anushasanam. It is just yoga and nothing else. But then when you started creating differentiation, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, mantra yoga, laya yoga, hatha yoga, this yoga, that yoga, then at the same time to make yourself aware of the very central goal for which these all yogas are preparatory. How to refer to that? So for that they use the word Raja Yoga. Now, as I pointed out in the very beginning, the word Raja does not only mean king. Many people completely go into misunderstandings. I've been asked question, does Raja Yoga mean that it is the yoga of kings, so only kings should practice it? Well, a king has to become a beggar to practice it. Until he does not become a beggar, he cannot practice it. So Raja there, as I pointed out, Raj, the root Raj in Sanskrit means light. So it is that yoga of inner light. Or yes, you can also translate it as the king of all yogas. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, we have this word, Raja Vidya, Raja Guhyam, Raja Vidya. The knowledge about the self is called the king of all knowledges, because all other knowledges are about something different from consciousness. They are about objects of consciousness, which are perceived through consciousness. But the understanding, the knowledge of the perceiver of consciousness itself is therefore the king of all knowledges, just in that sense. So similarly, this is about that. Therefore, it is called Raja Yoga. There is no superiority and inferiority sort of thing. It is just that some are preparatory steps and the other are more advanced steps. Now, that doesn't mean that something is superior something. Actually, the first step is as important and in fact more important than the last step. Because the last step has its root, has its very foundation in the first step itself. So the first step is the most important one. The first step that we take is the most important one. So,
I think translations create a lot of...
Yeah, translations create a lot of... I mean, Sanskrit is such an elastic... When we talk of this mental, physical elasticity, you know, lack of rigidity, if you can actually acquire on the level of a language, because language, otherwise language, a word is like a frame. And the moment you present something in a word, you have framed it like a picture. But with great masters, great meditative masters, such as Patanjali himself being one of the greatest grammarians, Maharshi Panini, Maharshi Katyayana, all these great Maharshis being the great grammarians of Sanskrit language, they have created a language which is, I think, the most elastic a person can get on a verbal level. And I think that is the beauty of Sanskrit language, that the words that are used are so elastic in nature, and the moment you translate it, you lose. Like you can translate a joke, yet you can't. It's not the same thing. It works in that. It is the same thing sometimes about the Upanishads, about the Gita. We try our best in our discussions, yet often when I go back and I look or think, contemplate on these teachings, many times I just think how to speak about this, how to put this into words, or how to put it into one word like the masters have put it into one word, yet there is so much in this one word. So yes, translation actually nails it. It completely then limits it.
There's the Austrian analytical philosopher Wittgenstein. He has a really great quote that says, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world."
The limits of my language are the limits of my world.
So I think about that a lot, actually.
Wow, wow,
like,
that's a beautiful...
Using her language, or when we have
the mathematician,
like,
yes.
It's like, oh, this is their ideas of how
exactly.
those words are used, kind of, you know, I mean, everyone, the limits are...
Yes. And then, of course, the final teaching is always in complete silence, which transcends all words.
Well, and
so,
it's interesting, the end of that book, it's called the Tractatus. The very end of it, it's a very famous quote, and it says, "What cannot be said must be left in silence."
What cannot be said must be left in silence. Wow. So the limit of my language is the limit of my world, and what cannot be said has to be left in silence. And that comes from a linguist.
Yeah, he's an analytical philosopher.
An analytical philosopher, Austrian, Wittgenstein. Oh, Wittgenstein,
Yeah.
okay. Wow. Yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasa saha. Exactly the same thing what the Upanishads are saying. Beautiful. I learned so much from these discussions, I tell you. Thank you so much, each one of you. Okay, let us conclude with a short prayer. Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayah, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet. Om Shantihi, Shantihi, Shantihi.